I used to think rules made a neighborhood safe, orderly, predictable, the kind of place where you could raise your kids, build a life, and sleep easy knowing everyone followed the same guidelines. That was before I understood what a homeowners association could become, how rules weren't tools for fairness, but weapons in the hands of people who craved control more than community. When I first moved into the Willow Bend Estates, it seemed perfect. Trimmed lawns, quiet streets, neighbors who waved even when they didn't know your name. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked good on postcards but felt faintly artificial underneath. Every house was painted within a 3-shade limit, every lawn trimmed to regulation length. Even the mailboxes were uniform, same posts, same spacing, same sterile perfection. For a while, I fit right in. I paid my dues, kept my yard clean, nodded politely at the board president, Linda Carver, a woman who made micromanagement look like an art form. She was the kind of neighbor who measured rule compliance by the inch. If a trash can stayed at the curb 10 minutes too long, she'd issue a written warning before your coffee even cooled. Started small. One morning, while mowing, I noticed Linda standing near the corner lot, clipboard clutched like a badge. She frowned at the property marker near my fence, a flag she'd been pretending not to inspect. The following week, I received a notice taped to my front door, boundary fence non-compliant with HOA survey. I read it twice, thinking it had to be a mistake. The fence had been there since before I moved in, 10 years at least. The previous owner had even shown me the plat map confirming it sat well inside the official property line. I wrote back politely, attaching the documents. No response. Days later, another letter arrived, this time stamped, "Final warning." The threat was clear. I had 10 days to restore the property boundary to compliance or face daily fines. At first, I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I tried to talk. I stopped by the HOA office, paperwork in hand, and waited outside Linda's office door while she typed emails with the kind of purpose reserved for people convinced they're saving civilization. She barely looked up, simply stating the matter was under review. That phrase haunted me for weeks. Under review. Translation: stalled until you comply or give up. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about who had more endurance, me defending what I knew was mine, or her dictating for the sake of dominance. A month later, she struck again. Another violation letter. This one citing encroachment beyond the community setback ordinance. The fine? $250 per day until corrected. They'd even tacked on legal fees incurred for review. Legal fees for a fence that had never been questioned until now. Neighbors began avoiding me. Some whispered about that guy who won't fix his fence. Others just looked away, afraid to associate with someone defying the board. The HOA's tactic was simple. Isolate the resistance until it dissolves. But I wasn't dissolving. That fence had stood long before Linda's clipboard reigned over this neighborhood, and I wasn't about to pay for a lie. I hired a private surveyor, an independent one, not the HOA's go-to firm, and let him mark the exact boundary line with bright, unmistakable ribbons. When the report came in 3 weeks later, it confirmed what I already knew. The fence was fully within my property. Armed with proof, I thought the fight would end. I remember standing in front of Linda's pristine white garage, the survey folder in my hand, believing this evidence would make sense to her, that she'd shrug, apologize, and move on. But she didn't care. The following week, the HOA's attorney sent me an official determination of violation. They had, apparently, reassessed the plat map and confirmed encroachment. Their map, conveniently, a copy of the same document I just disproved, except theirs had been edited. The measurements had shifted. Property lines on paper had been warped just enough to favor their narrative. It wasn't incompetence. It was calculated. That day, standing at the edge of my yard, staring at that weathered stretch of wooden slats, a realization took root. The kind that doesn't whisper, but burns. If they wanted to play this game with rules, I would give them rules they couldn't break. I spent nights at my kitchen table, laptop glowing, studying building codes, boundary laws, and easement restrictions. I learned about variance appeals, zoning ordinances, and the tiny legal loopholes buried deep in public record databases no HOA president ever expects a homeowner to find. What I discovered changed everything. Buried in a decades-old ordinance was a clause about dual-purpose structures, an obscure provision stating that landowners may construct decorative barriers or retaining structures on property lines, provided they serve an additional ecological function. It was designed for flood control, but never precisely defined what decorative or ecological meant. It was a loophole, a big one. A fence could suddenly become a soil-retaining structure, a pollinator barrier, or even an erosion control system. It wasn't just allowed, it was protected. If I built the right kind of fence, the HOA would have no jurisdiction. Not over its height, not over its appearance, not even over its existence. For the first time since the letters began, I smiled. Linda wanted to drag me through regulations until I broke. But I was about to build something she couldn't touch, a fence that stood not just on wood and nails, but on the very rules she thought made her untouchable. Something told me she'd explode when she realized what I was about to do, and I couldn't wait. The idea for the loophole fence started as a small flicker, a petty fantasy about building something so clever that it mocked the HOA with every nail I drove in. But the more I studied, the more I realized it didn't have to be petty at all. Could be brilliant, could be legal, and best of all, it could be permanent. I spent nights buried in municipal codes and zoning maps. While most people in Willow Bend turned off their porch lights and went to bed, I was in the glow of my kitchen, scrolling through pages of government PDFs that looked older than the neighborhood itself. I wasn't reading for revenge. I was reading for precision. And there it was again. Section 14.2b of the city's property ordinance. My golden ticket. It stated that an owner's right to construct a dual-purpose barrier on their lot shall be preserved under environmental exemption law provided the structure contributes to soil retention, flood control, or biological resource protection. It was written decades ago, some obscure environmental measure meant for farmers, but it had never been repealed. And legally, HOAs couldn't supersede municipal exemptions. Their power ended where city code began. All I had to do was make my fence count as an environmental barrier. For the next several weeks, I quietly gathered what I needed. Treated cedar boards, lattice insides, shallow support trenches filled with compacted soil. I consulted a silent friend of mine, a contractor who hated HOAs even more than I did. I told him I needed something durable, innovative, but technically green infrastructure. He smirked and handed me blueprints that could have doubled as a work of art. By March, I was ready. The warm weekend came with clear skies, and I started digging. Each shovelful landed like a quiet defiance. The smell of earth, mixed with sawdust and sweat, felt oddly purifying after months of paperwork and fines. I worked sunrise to sunset, boards rising one panel at a time. Neighbors peeked from their driveways, whispering among themselves. Word traveled fast that I was causing trouble again. Halfway through, Linda strutted down the sidewalk like a storm cloud in designer shoes. She stopped at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, face locked into that familiar expression of control barely holding together. Without speaking, she scribbled furiously on her clipboard, then marched off. I smiled to myself. Let her write. This time, her pen couldn't touch me. By Sunday evening, the fence stood complete, 6 feet tall, reinforced, capped with planter boxes filled with creeping vines and native wildflowers. Beneath, I'd installed a narrow drainage trench filled with gravel and soil to facilitate runoff absorption. To the untrained eye, it was just a beautiful privacy fence. But in the eyes of the law, it was something far more specific, a certified ecological structure under public ordinance. That night, I submitted the official documentation online, blueprints labeled erosion control and pollinator habitat barrier. I even filed for the free environmental exemption license number that converted my fence from private property into a legally recognized environmental feature. Once approved and entered into the public register, the HOA could no longer claim jurisdiction over it. 3 days later, Linda appeared again, this time accompanied by a board member holding a camera. They circled the fence like vultures, taking photos, whispering loudly enough for me to hear words like non-approved, unauthorized materials, and height violation. A week after that came the letter, Your structure violates HOA Policy 4.7. Immediate removal required. It ended with the familiar threat, daily fines for noncompliance. I've been waiting for it. That afternoon, I printed my response. 5 pages of legal citations, code excerpts, and the environmental permit number highlighted in bold. I walked the letter straight to their office, handed it to Linda personally, and left before she could even open it. I didn't need her reaction. I could already imagine it. That weekend, the board called an emergency meeting. You could feel the tension ripple through the neighborhood as suited members gathered under the glowing street lamps outside the club office, gesturing and gesticulating like generals before a war they didn't understand. My inbox began to fill with HOA follow-ups requesting clarification. Then came the veiled threats, warnings about potential city review, insurance liability concerns, and aesthetic inconsistencies endangering resale values. But what they didn't realize was simple. The moment that environmental permit was logged, my fence stopped existing as a personal fixture under their authority. It now qualified as a civic feature, minor as it was, protected by the same laws they'd been hiding behind for years. Technically, to remove it would mean violating environmental code, and to do that, they'd need city approval, not homeowner compliance. And guess who the city sided with when I showed them the paperwork? Not the HOA. The tone of their letters changed overnight. No more threats, just requests for reconsideration. Linda's confidence cracked in stages. First came the polite confusions, then the passive-aggressive smiles. Eventually, it became open bitterness. Her walking by the fence every morning just to glare at it like it had personally betrayed her. Neighbors started whispering too. Less about my rebellion this time, and more with curiosity. How'd he get away with it? They said. Is that really legal? The HOA's fearmongering was dissolving, replaced by fascination. And if there's one thing HOAs hate more than noncompliance, it's precedent. I started noticing things. A few houses down, someone hung a non-approved garden trellis. Another neighbor installed a rainwater tank disguised as a planter box. By the end of the month, at least 3 residents submitted their own environmental exemptions. Linda tried to clamp down, but the law was clear. My fence hadn't just protected me, it had opened the floodgates. Their entire system, once airtight and absolute, was leaking from the inside, not from vandalism or defiance, but from exposure. Every glance Linda cast my way now wasn't just frustration. It was fear, because she understood before anyone else. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about the cracks forming beneath the perfect surface of her control. For a while, the neighborhood settled into uneasy quiet. The fence stood firm, vines crawling higher, bees tracing lazy circles around the flowers. My neighbors began to relax again, even chuckle when Linda passed by with her clipboard and tight smile. But people like her never stay quiet for long. The calm was only the surface. Beneath, the HOA was regrouping. I knew something was brewing the moment the official envelope showed up. Heavy paper, precise lettering, legal tone dripping off every word. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a notice of external review. According to them, a committee of environmental consultants would be inspecting my property for policy compliance under municipal code integration. It sounded sophisticated until I realized it meant one thing. They were trying to outsmart my loophole using bureaucracy. 2 days later, Linda led the so-called consultants into the neighborhood. 5 of them, all wearing bright safety vests, clipboards in hand, pretending to assess drainage and soil like they were scientists in a lab. I recognized 2 of them immediately, HOA members. The others, probably friends playing expert for the day. They roamed my yard, taking photos of the fence, whispering, pointing to the flower boxes and drainage trench like they'd uncovered a threat to civilization. I kept still, watching from the porch. That evening, another HOA email arrived. Their tone was polite, but the message was pure venom. They claimed the fence had created unauthorized structural modifications to the easement line, and they were requesting clarification from county zoning. Translation: they'd gone over the environmental exemption and were trying to revoke it. It was bold and stupid, Because city law required proof beyond reason to challenge an approved environmental structure. They were grasping at straws. Still, I knew better than to underestimate Linda. When people like her lose authority, they don't back off, they dig deeper. Sure enough, the following week, she called for a special board session dedicated entirely to my property. Flyers appeared on mailboxes calling it the Community Standards Hearing. That title said it all. This wasn't about my fence anymore. It was about publicly reestablishing their control. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was full. Residents I hadn't seen in months showed up, curiosity painted across their faces. Linda sat at the front table next to her vice president, the consultants seated behind them like loyal soldiers. On the wall behind her, a projector displayed a photo of my fence like evidence in a courtroom. She started with formalities, reading from folders, emphasizing rules, warning about negative precedent. Then came the dramatics. She spoke about maintaining aesthetic harmony, about protecting property values, and how individual defiance threatens collective good. Every sentence was rehearsed. Every look meant to paint me as the villain. But people weren't nodding like they used to. They were listening carefully. When she unveiled her latest evidence, a murmur rippled through the room. It was a photo of my fence, taken at an angle to make it look taller than 6 feet. Below it, a label I hadn't seen before, reported safety risk. Apparently, the HOA now claimed my fence was a potential hazard in high winds. The argument was ludicrous. They were trying to bypass environmental protection by declaring it unsafe. Linda leaned forward theatrically. The HOA cannot allow structures that endanger this community, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound noble. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to speak yet. Not until they overstepped. And they did. When the slide flipped again, Linda introduced her trump card, a supposed expert report from their favorite surveyor, the one tied to the original falsified violation. His report accused my structure of non-compliance. The room grew tense. For a moment, I could see neighbors shifting uncomfortably. Not because they believed her, but because they'd seen this script before. Then she made her final mistake. She claimed the HOA had filed a complaint with the city asking for enforcement of removal. The problem? They hadn't realized I had friends at City Hall. By the next morning, my phone buzzed with an email from the city environmental coordinator. A polite warning that the HOA's complaint had been marked invalid and was closed. The report I'd filed with all the correct zoning references had been airtight. The city had even flagged the HOA's submission as frivolous and repetitive. So I decided to respond the best way possible, publicly, using their own rules. At the next meeting, I brought my binder thick, organized, and calm. I waited until the open forum session, stood, and placed a printed letter from the city right on the desk in front of Linda. The letter clearly stated that my fence was fully compliant, exempt from HOA oversight, and legally designated as an ecological feature under environmental code. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper. Just the sound of control evaporating in real time. Linda's confidence cracked, visibly this time. Her fingers tensed around the edge of her clipboard, her fake smile twitching. Her attempt at a rebuttal stumbled. That documentation is under evaluation, she murmured. But even her own board members were looking down by then. Someone in the audience, an older man from 2 streets over, clapped once. Then again. Then a few more followed. Within seconds, the room filled with applause. Not for me. Not for defiance. For closure. The HOA's reign of constant fear and paperwork was breaking, and everyone felt it. By the next week, the inspection program quieted down. No more phantom experts. No new notices. The board went back to petty chores and routine business. Landscaping budgets, newsletter announcements, bake sales. The fire was gone. But Linda hadn't truly given up. I saw her every few days still walking the sidewalks, looking over fences with bitter restraint, as if searching for one more technicality to reclaim her power. Only now she couldn't touch me. Every time her glare landed on that vine-covered wall, It reminded her that she'd lost the one thing people like her crave the most: control. It became symbolic. The fence wasn't just mine anymore. It was the neighborhood's quiet rebellion. I'd see other homeowners start pushing back too. A few installed pollinator gardens. Others built small rock borders, rain collection barrels, even creative pergolas. Things that blurred the line between yard design and exempt ecological use. The board tried to resist at first, but each new exemption cited my precedent. The HOA's authority, once absolute, was turning into a technical inconvenience, an outdated relic in a community that was learning to think for itself. That was the victory. Not that I'd beaten them in one fight, but that I'd cracked the foundation of their reign with the one thing they'd built their power on: the rules. For weeks, the fence stood as a quiet victory, an unassuming wall draped in vines and wildflowers that hummed with bees. To me, it was just a project, a carefully constructed loophole, a personal rebellion hidden in plain sight. But to the neighbors, it had become much more. They whispered about it like folklore. Children pointed at it as they passed on bicycles. Even visiting relatives would stop to ask questions. "That's the one the HOA tried to tear down," they'd say. A few people started calling it the legal fence. Others, jokingly, called it the wall of freedom. It should have stayed a neighborhood joke. Just another suburban story that fizzled out after a few weeks. But stories, like fences, sometimes take on lives of their own. It started with a photo. A passerby walking their dog snapped a shot of the fence, sunlight spilling through the lattice, flowers curling over the top, captioned with a quip: "When the HOA finds you, but you understand the law better than they do." Within days, that photo spread like wildfire. It appeared on local neighborhood forums, then Facebook, then Reddit, where someone reposted it under the title, "Man outsmarts HOA with a fence they can't touch." Thousands of comments poured in. Sympathy, amusement, questions, advice, jokes about building freedom fences across the country. People began tagging local news stations, urging them to find the legend who did this. And find me, they did. The first reporter reached out through email, polite, professional, intrigued. Then another followed. Soon, the story hit local TV under the segment name Fence Fight Victory. They called it the perfect underdog tale. One homeowner versus an overreaching HOA. The next week, a small film crew stood in front of my yard, cameras rolling while they narrated the saga. They captured everything: the lush vine growth, the humming bees, the neat drainage trench that gave it legitimacy. The angle was flattering, almost cinematic. When the piece aired, it didn't stay local for long. National channels picked it up under the weird news banner. Headlines followed: "The HOA loophole you wish you knew about." "This man built a fence they couldn't tear down." "How environmental law saved one homeowner from bureaucracy." Overnight, my inbox flooded. Messages from strangers across states poured in. Some wanted advice. Others shared their own war stories with HOAs, tales of outrageous fines and absurd power trips. People sent photos of their own fences, their first rebellious paint jobs, their small acts of defiance. The world was tired of control disguised as community. And at the center of it all was a 6-foot wooden structure that had become the symbol of standing your ground. Literally. But while most of the world laughed, the HOA did not. The attention infuriated Linda. Her power had always depended on silence, on the idea that people feared her authority. But now, she'd become the villain in a story shared by tens of thousands of people. She wasn't Linda anymore. She was that HOA president. Pressure mounted from above. Board members resigned. Sponsors for their community newsletter backed away. Even realtors began to worry that the scandal was lowering property appeal. A few bold residents began pushing for a vote to restructure the board altogether. Linda tried everything to regain control. She issued official statements to local papers about property values endangered by social media myths. She circulated flyers claiming the media had misinterpreted the rules. At one point, she even filed a complaint claiming the viral exposure had caused her emotional distress. But it only made her look worse. When the HOA called another meeting to discuss the public relations crisis, Hardly anyone showed up. Those who did couldn't help smirking when they saw her lists of proposed reform measures. The louder she fought, the smaller she looked. Meanwhile, the city quietly stepped in again. With so much public attention, they launched an audit on multiple HOAs across the county to ensure none were overstepping residential governance limits. That was the true ripple effect, the one Linda didn't see coming. It wasn't just my fence that had become untouchable. It was the law itself setting new boundaries for entities like hers. Municipal records started calling for stricter oversight of HOA bylaws, reducing unilateral penalties, and forcing transparency in enforcement. What had begun as one petty neighborhood dispute had now forced city-level reform. The irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't set out to start anything grand. I'd only wanted peace. But the thing about standing firm in the face of abuse is that it gives permission for others to do the same. A month after the news frenzy, reporters moved on, leaving behind their unused footage and forgotten hashtags. Life at Willow Bend slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of it. You could feel it in the air. Less tension, more laughter, fewer clipped warnings and passive-aggressive newsletters. People had started planting things again. Climbing ivy, tall shrubs, backyard projects no longer submitted for review. It was like everyone had collectively decided to stop asking for permission to exist. Linda's position lasted another 2 months before she abruptly resigned. The resignation notice was short and signed at the bottom, her final refusal to acknowledge defeat. Her house went up for sale soon after. Some said she moved to another neighborhood across town, one with stricter standards. Others said she swore off HOAs entirely. I didn't care. The vines on my fence had started to bloom by then, curtains of green and white woven across the boards like nature reclaiming something long constrained. Standing there on a warm afternoon, watching the wind shift through leaves, I understood what she never could. It had never been about control or compliance or even power. It had been about space. The simple right to carve out your own corner of peace in a world that constantly tries to reshape it. And no matter how many rules she'd written, she couldn't touch that. The fence hadn't just defended my property. It had drawn a new kind of line, the line between what they could dictate and what they could never own. Years passed, and with them the memory of the fight began to fade, at least for everyone else. The fence, though, remained. It outlasted the noise, the outrage, and the endless arguments about community and conformity. When storms came through in later seasons, tearing shingles off roofs and scattering trash bins down the street, the fence held firm. It never swayed, not once. By then, most of the old HOA board was gone. The rigid policies that once governed everything from mailbox paint to flower colors had quietly vanished with them. What replaced it was something gentler, a neighborhood that looked less perfect but felt more alive. The new HOA, if you could even call it that, was run by people who had learned from Linda's reign. They didn't send warnings. They sent postcards asking for suggestions. They didn't fine people for painting their shutters blue. They complimented it. The rulebook had shrunk from 30 pages to 3, and it mostly said one thing: be a good neighbor. It wasn't flawless, but it was freedom. Every morning, the scent of jasmine still drifted from my wall, carried on the breeze that rolled through the open yards. What used to divide the street, fences, grudges, petty rivalries, had somehow drawn people closer. We started helping each other with small things. Fixing mailboxes, repairing driveways, planting new trees. The conversations that had once happened through tense emails now happened over shared cups of coffee. And through it all, the fence stood. Its wood had weathered to a soft silvery hue, the vines thick with life. Birds nested in its corners. Bees hovered lazily around its blossoms. Children drew chalk outlines against it during summer afternoons, leaving behind small handprints that lingered like signatures. Every mark was a story. Once I caught a teenage boy from the next block taking photos of it. When I asked what for, he said his history teacher had given them a project on everyday symbols of change. He told me his mom had lived here when the fence went up, that she'd once been terrified of defying the HOA. But you did, he said, and I realized then that my small act of defiance had turned into something far bigger. What began as a fight for property rights had become a lesson written into wood and ivy, A reminder that even when you're told you can't win, sometimes you can just outlast them instead. Over time, people from other neighborhoods drove through Willow Bend just to see it. Some called it the fence that changed everything. Others simply smiled, snapping quick pictures before driving off again. It became a quiet landmark. No plaques needed. Just something real standing where constraint once reigned. As for Linda, I did see her once more years later in a grocery store across town. Her hair was shorter, her confidence gone, her clipboard replaced by a reusable shopping bag. For a moment, she caught my eye. Recognition flickered, then faded. We didn't speak. Maybe there was nothing left to say. I don't think she ever understood that her downfall wasn't personal. It wasn't even about the fence. It was about the truth that control always collapses under its own weight. It's strange now, looking back. The battles that felt so suffocating at the time seem almost small in hindsight, like stepping stones that led to peace without realizing it. The bitterness that used to fill my chest has softened, replaced by gratitude. Not because the struggle was easy, but because it revealed something important. Boundaries only matter when you're protecting something worth holding. The fence taught me that. Neighbors still ask sometimes if I'll ever take it down, now that the HOA doesn't care anymore. My answer is always the same. No, it's part of this place now, rooted too deeply to remove, not just into the ground, but into the story of how we learned to stand up for ourselves. Sometimes, in the early morning light, I sit on the porch with coffee in hand, watching sunlight filter through the vines. I listen to the low hum of bees and the faint laughter of kids in the street. The neighborhood doesn't look perfect anymore. The lawns don't match. The paint on some houses has faded. But that's the beauty of it now. It finally looks real. True harmony, I learned, doesn't come from sameness. Comes from choice, from the freedom to grow however you're meant to. The fence became that choice made visible. A living wall between tyranny and integrity, planted by one tired man with a shovel and a stubborn will. And long after I've gone, I know it will still stand here, gently swaying in the wind, wrapped in vines, watched by new families who will never know the full story of how one fence rewrote the rules of an entire street. They'll just know it kept standing.